I'm Andrew Davies. I'm the CEO of B Lab here in Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. And it's really exciting to have you joining us today. For those of you who've been lucky enough to hear us through our tech check, then an additional welcome for you. We opened this up nice and early. I live and usually work on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country in Naarm. I'm descended from English and Welsh folk who first came to Australia seeking fortune in the 19th century gold rush. Today, I'm really lucky to be on Gadigal land, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And for those from other places, that's the little city also known as Sydney. B Lab actually now operates on every continent except Antarctica. Our B Lab team here works across the lands known as Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. In Australia, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of all lands on which we work and visit. We recognise the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities' strength and resilience in the face of colonisation. We honour their continuing connection to land, water and skies, and recognise that for thousands of years, as the oldest continuing civilisation on this planet, they've lived the values we now work to share: inclusivity, sustainability and regeneration. In Aotearoa, we pay our respects to Ngāi Iwi Taki Taki and honour the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi: protection, participation and partnership. My very small job today is to introduce these three wonderful people on your screen. I want to start with Joe Kelly, someone I've had the pleasure of working closely with throughout the last year or so, and now the CEO of Tuitu Tahua, New Zealand's Centre for Sustainable Finance. Formerly Sustainability and Corporate Responsibility Senior Manager at Deloitte, New Zealand, which is actually where we first met back in 2019, when I was still learning what B Lab did on my very first trip to New Zealand. As a little sidebar, Joe counselled me on that trip not to lean too hard into using a Maori term in a presentation that I just learned, advice that I ignored, hence learnt my first lesson of working with Joe. She's always right: listen more and talk less. With director roles at the B team, coming out of advertising, and before that working in Melbourne bars that I wasn't cool enough to get into, Joe has been there and done that and brings enormous wisdom to not just our conversation today, but also, very happy to share this, to us for some time to come as the newest appointed member of the B Lab Australia and Aotearoa New Zealand Board of Directors. The other two people here need a little introduction to most of you. So I'm actually going to steal something I read in an article recently because I thought it captured it nicely. When Andrew Kassoy, Bart Houlahan and Jay Cohen-Gilbert co-founded B Lab in 2006, the idea of using business for good hadn't yet taken off. It was pre-financial crisis, shareholder primacy was the only rule of the game, and the financial world hadn't had its time of reckoning. But the system was flawed, inherently growing social inequalities and climate change. So they set off to change it. I really like that. It captures much, but what it misses is perhaps a bit more about Andrew and Bart, and they both have extraordinary backgrounds in business and finance, an entrepreneurial spirit, and a drive to create change. The three of you, including Jay, were very much the right people in the right place at the right time to start something special, and it's been an absolute privilege to spend the last few years working with Bart and Andrew and connecting with Jay as well, and seeing their incredible vision come to a point of growing influence globally. They are inspiring leaders, always generous with their time, providing invaluable support to us at B Lab in this region and the growing community of B Corps that have been here since 2012. Change has indeed come, and whilst we have an awful lot more to do, the growing conversation about the role of business today represents a shift in expectations of investors, consumers, employees, and businesses themselves. B Corps are at the front of this. I heard someone say recently that the plethora of new reporting frameworks show you where a business sits, but B Corps show you where they stand. And it is those who stand up who will ultimately bring the change we need to bring an inclusive, equitable and regenerative economic system. And with that, Joe, we really couldn't think of a better person to throw the really curly questions at Andrew and Bart. So I want to hand over to you. Encourage anyone in the audience to put questions into the chat or the Q&A function anytime, and we'll do our best to get to those. Otherwise, we're going to have a wild ride. Joe, you're in charge. Over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for that introduction. Bart and Andrew, I need to disclose out of the gate here, this is kind of like a life goal. So I'm very, honoured to be in this conversation and just have the opportunity to spend some unfiltered time with you both. So I'm going to open with the same question for both of you, and I'm not going to take it easy on either of you. My question is, just sharing with us, I guess, one or two of the most important things that you've learned in the 15 years of building this movement. Who wants to go first?
Bart does. I'm happy to go first since I'm off mute. And it's nice to see you, Joe and Andrew. Thank you for such a gracious introduction. And Joe, if this is a life goal, you definitely need to set your sights much higher. We're not that interesting.
I like to achieve them.
All right. Well, in that case, we're easy. I guess I would start with the most important thing that I've learned over and over again over the course of the last 15 years is that everything that we do starts and ends with relationships. And so, we spend a lot of time both like way up here talking about strategy and theories of change and the way we're going to try to change capitalism so that it actually serves people, like people on the planet. And we spend a lot of time buried in the operations of a global network of organizations and how the details of how a certification works. And all those things are really important. But at the end of the day, the thing that makes it all actually work are the relationships, like the personal relationships that I think people in the B Corp community have been hungry to build and have built over the last 15 years. And those relationships are global. And the learnings that come from that are both extraordinary and inspiring.
And I would pick up on that and say that the two probably biggest learnings, Joe, have been, number one, the importance of distributed leadership. That if you want to build a movement, it's not going to be built by 3 white dudes in the United States, and it's going to necessarily require letting go and distributing leadership and having kind of concentric circles of leaders across the globe who are driving this movement to use business as a force for good, starting first with obviously our network of B Labs and Sistema Bays all across the globe, but probably more importantly, Joe, the community of certified B corporations who are out front kind of leading this broader movement, and then all of the companies that come and join and want to be more like B corporations. Those concentric circles establish a really beautiful network of leaders all over the globe that are driving this change. And I remember really tangibly the moment when I realized that that network of leaders was going to be critical, and that this was no longer about Bart, Jay, and Andrew. It was honestly our very first Champions Retreat, probably 15 years ago now, 14, 15 years ago, when it was really clear that the founding B corporations that came to that retreat appropriately felt like they owned this movement, that it was theirs, that they had a piece of it, and that they were also accountable for its success. And that has just beautifully blossomed over 16 years, where there are now darn near 5,000 B corporations who have that feeling of ownership. So that would be first. And then secondly, I'd say I've had my own reckoning with what leadership should look like. In that for much of my career prior to B Lab, I was rewarded for being out front and being the first to speak and making sure that people heard me clearly and loudly as I shared my thoughts. And as I've grown more aware of the enormous challenges presented by that white male leadership and the need for and the importance of other voices at the table, how I lead looks quite different than how it used to manifest itself. And so now I try to listen more and create more space, value other voices, and ultimately, I think that makes us a stronger team. And that's been, honestly, Joe, a transition for me that I'm still learning. I'm still doing my best to get better at, but it has definitely been a learning over the last 16 and a half years of BLAB.
Thank you. It's very honest answer. So as you transition into a new global CEO and new leadership around the organization, where do you hope that they will take us in the next decade, which is a really critical time?
So we've been contemplating, Joe, this transition to a new global lead executive for darn near 3 years. And it was driven by a recognition about 3 years ago that what we had built was not, frankly, fit for purpose. We had aspirations, wild, crazy aspirations to change, global capitalism. Yet what we had built was an organization that was US centric with sister nonprofits around the globe. And our aspirations were really global, Joe. And what that meant was we had to really focus over a period of really 3 years to transition the organization, number one, from a US organization to a global organization. And that meant spinning off BLAB US and Canada, so that BLAB US and Canada is no different than BLAB Australia, New Zealand, or BLAB Europe, or BLAB UK. Number two, we needed a new global leadership team. So we had to lift up our global partners, give them voice, representation, and ownership at the table. And then finally, Joe, we had to recognize that there needed to be new leadership for this movement. There's a natural time when an organization needs to pivot from co-founder energy to a more professionally run and organized organization. We're at that moment, like the inflection point we are at. I think everybody can feel, right? You can feel that the foundation has been laid. 5,000 certified B corporations, 200,000 companies using our tools, and tens of thousands of companies that have adopted our legal framework. There's this amazing foundation. Now, if we can bring in amazing new leadership who know how to take an organization from startup to the growth phase and really see that inflection point, that hockey stick growth over the next few years, I think that's exactly where we are. And I think that's what we found in Eleanor Allen. And what's great, Joe, is coming back to the first comment, is Eleanor is not alone, right? There has been a beautiful transition happening across the network where we're bringing in those types of leaders who are ready for the growth opportunity presented by the foundation that has been laid by many of the folks who are on the call who were early adopters of this movement. So that's kind of where we find ourselves at, with a really solid foundation, enormous momentum, and a pivot to growth leadership. Andrew, you want to talk a little bit about what it looks like 10 years down the road, what you want to see happen?
Sure. I mean, one thing I was going to just add is that one of the really cool things is that during this search process that was started a year ago for a new leader for BLAB Global, and for those who don't know, like BLAB Global is one organization in this constellation of organizations all over the world that are building the B Corp movement in their regions. When we went through that search process, we just sort of assumed that this person would have like a title of CEO, and Eleanor, who I hope all of you in the community will get to meet at some point soon, during the search process, as they were getting close to choosing her, said the title I'd actually like to have is lead executive instead of CEO. And she chose that, I think, because she recognized this idea that Bart was just talking about, like this is a movement made up of lots of leaders. And there's a role for, there are times when there's a role for someone to play a sort of a centralized leadership role, but as one of many, or a player coach, or leader of a group of peers. And so she chose that title. And I think in many ways that like cemented it for the B Lab Global Board, that that's how she was thinking about what this role is in an interdependent movement built on relationships and distributed leadership. So I'm really excited about her. And the only negative is that she still has got to finish up in her previous role, and so she doesn't actually start at B Lab until June. So we're still in it for a little while.
Thank you. And that second part of the question, looking out over the next 10 years, looking out to, let's even say 2030, not 10 years anymore. What are your hopes for where she'll take it, or where they'll take it?
Well, ultimately, I mean, the B Corp movement has to continue to scale if it wants to have an influence, not just on changing the behavior of individual businesses that are part of the community, but actually changing the economic systems, changing the economic system. Like the game that I think that we're in, and it's probably not even the right thing to call it a game, because it's serious, but that is to try to change the system, not try to change the behavior of individual businesses. And so that can be a kind of a confusing idea, because at the same time, like, what we need is companies that want to lead and want to change their own behavior and grow and work together to sit at the core of that movement. That's what being a B Corp is all about. Ultimately, it's about being the leader of a movement. And setting that example for everybody else to follow. But if we want to change the system, then that community has to continue to scale, not just scale in numbers, but scale in impact and scale in influence. And so one part of our job, I think, as a global community is to hold ourselves to ever higher standards. And in doing that, to drive more and more positive impact directly on the stakeholders that each of us have, on our workers, the communities in which we all do business, the environment. But then there's also this like broader responsibility, I think, to work together to take like collective action. And whether that's collective action on things like climate or inequality, or whether it's collective action on public policy, I think that over time, maybe one of the most important things that this community can do together is to try to change the rules of business for everyone, not just for the leaders, but for all. And that's a long game, trying to change public policy so that we don't need B Corps because all companies are B Corps. That's going to take the next 10 years, and I think there's huge power in setting that as our objective.
Joe, I'm happy to add to that a little bit.
Yeah.
Again, zooming all the way out, I think hopefully everybody on the call knows what we're here trying to do collectively. Like, we're trying to create a better economy, one that kind of works for everyone better, that it's more inclusive, more equitable, and regenerative. That's the end goal. That's the vision that we're all working on. And this community of leaders, certified B corporations, really are a means to an end, right? If we can tell their story, lift them up, they will build a broader movement of people who want to be more like a B corporation, right? So that they buy from, patronize, work for, invest in these higher purpose companies. That's the element of the movement that we're trying to all build together to create this different economy. And we talk about 3 different types of change that will be necessary to get to that end game, that vision: behavioral change, structural change, and cultural change. And it's interesting that I feel like all 3 right now are at this inflection point. And if we project out 10 years from now, the opportunities are enormous. On the behavioral change side, what we're really talking about is, what do companies manage? What do they count? What are the elements that they use to report, manage, and improve upon? And there's a massive shift happening right now across the globe of new metrics that people are using to try to count things differently. And we're now no longer just counting Australian dollars, right? We're counting environmental footprint and employee engagement and community impact. All of that is part of how we're inspiring behavior change. And so that's one massive lever that's being pulled. On the structural change side, we got to change the institutions. Ultimately, that means legal change, where companies are required to behave differently legally, where they have accountability. And that is happening right now in 80 different jurisdictions. We have figured out the legal framework where companies must behave differently and they're legally accountable for considering the impact of their decisions on stakeholders. And so that's the second piece, right? Structural change, where we fundamentally change the law so that all companies have to consider their stakeholders. And then third and finally is cultural change. How do we all define success in business? And that is where the community of certified B corporations are so critical. They are the stories that we tell that manifest that vision that we hope all companies lead into in 10 years from now. And so all three of those are really at this beautiful inflection point, and all three will be necessary, Joe, if we really expect a different economy.
Great, thank you. I'd like to go from there just to talk a little bit about this necessary growth in the movement, because it's a movement that needs to scale, but it's based on integrity and trust, right? So the early days, businesses are relatively small, real clarity of purpose, and then the movement grows and it includes Danone and Natura and the bigger companies at the bigger end of town. And so there's a natural tension there. So in your view, as more large and listed businesses pursue certification, how does the movement retain its integrity and hold fast to the trust and the credibility of the B?
Super great question. And there's lots of different pieces of that question I'm going to try to tease apart real quickly. The first is, what are we trying to scale, Joe? Like at the end of the question, scale is critical. If we're trying to build a movement, we're going to need scale. But the question is, scale of what? And I believe, though we need to continue to grow the community of certified B corporations, let's always remember that they are the tip of the spear, the leaders of a much broader movement. And the question is, how do we scale their influence as much as how many certified B corporations we attract to the community? And so you always got to remember what you're trying to scale. We're not trying to, like, the end game isn't to have all companies certified as B corporations. The end game is a different economy. And to get there, we think we need this leadership set. And so number one, know what you're trying to scale. And to me, we're scaling the movement led by an exemplary group of leaders, the community of certified B corporations. And then secondly, from that premise, you got to scale with integrity, right? And I think tension's the right word, Joe. Like, we have to be able to hold both. You have to be able to hold the need to continue to grow the community of certified B corporations while not losing the rigor, the integrity, the credibility of the certification. Because once that's lost, nobody's inspired to follow. There is no movement that's going to continue to grow. And so that is the beautiful tension between the two. And honestly, we think, and I think this is held by the network, the entire B Lab network of leaders, we think bringing in larger companies is critical. We have to show that this idea can happen, not just with our beautiful small, medium community of certified B corporations, but also with larger multinationals. But we got to be careful in that growth. We have to choose the right ones. We have to make sure that they meet the bar. And to that end, Joe, when we started to consider the standards for multinationals, this was probably about 5 years ago, we put together something called the Multinational and Public Market Advisory Council. And what they came back with was that they actually raised the standards for multinationals. It is actually harder to be a certified B corporation as a multinational, just to make sure that we get the right partners who are going to join this amazing community to help build the broader movement. And so it is about holding attention and leaning into it and scaling with integrity.
Andrew, I'd love to hear your reflections on this topic.
I think Bart said it pretty well. I don't have all that much to add. I think, it's important. I guess I'd repeat something Bart said, like it's important. We can't change the economic system if large companies can't change their behavior. So somehow or another, we need to meet them somewhere on that road and pull them along. And I think it's fair to say they know, even the ones that are leaders that we're talking to, they know that they're not leading this movement. They know that for the most part, they know that they're followers. And actually, I think a pretty good sign has been the ones that have had sort of like the humility to recognize that, to sort of think of it like, hey, we're coming here and we'd like to join your community, like you're as in like all of you who are on, and learn, because we're inspired by many of the businesses that are already here. I think is like often like a pretty good indicator of who actually belongs. The people who sort of show up like telling you about how great they are. That's usually a pretty good indicator that they're actually not going to make it through the certification process. Because as anybody who's been through the certification process knows, it can be a humbling experience no matter who you are. And imagine what that's like if you've got a very large company with a lot of legacy businesses all over the world. Like we're not easy on them in that process. And I think, but it's instructive to me that there are some that are still here and want to be a part of it. And often, what you hear is either you'll hear about like a CEO who was very inspired by a small company in the B Corp community that does something amazing. Like I was talking to a CEO not that long ago who'd heard about this company that's based in New York, in Yonkers, New York. They make the brownies that go into Ben and Jerry's chocolate fudge brownie ice cream called Grayston Bakery. And they have this amazing set of practices around hiring, where they primarily hire people who've been previously incarcerated as they're coming out of prison. And this CEO of this company was like astounded and inspired by this model enough that they want to put it into their much larger, like multinational, and try to figure out how to use it. But they know that they need to learn from this inspiring $15 million business. So I think it's often that. Or it's employees of large multinationals that are pushing up to the executive suite of these companies saying, we want to be like that, and why shouldn't we be able to? So I think this is less about us chasing those kinds of companies and more about setting an example that they want to be a part of. And then, as Bart said, holding that bar high for them. And making them jump. And in the process, hopefully that makes them better, and that makes the world better, because there are a lot of big companies that they have a huge influence. And the last thing I think is that, Bart talked about culture shift a fair amount, like changing the narrative about the purpose of business. And it's just true that these, like the large multinationals, have a very big bullhorn. They have a big stage that they stand on. And so if they can help us tell that story, but with integrity, then I think it's more likely that we're able to communicate that narrative in a way that we might not have the resources amongst the smaller companies and our own organization.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So it's interesting, my reflection on the movement has been that you, whether true or not, you have always seemed to have a really good understanding of where you are in the system and the role that you want to play, and as a movement, and working on some of the strategic stuff with Andrew and the team last year, that it became even more true for me. There's a clarity of intent and a clarity of understanding about the theory of change. And I wonder, with the movement, many faces, many facets of the movement as it kind of grows around the globe, what have you been able to predict, and what has really surprised you about the last 15 years and the way that the movement has taken form?
I'll happily, you're on mute, Andrew, so.
I was just going to say I'm more full of things that have surprised me than things that we predicted. I wish that we were good enough to have predicted much. The thing that has been the most, well, the few things that have really like surprised me. One is that while we knew when we started that that we should be trying to build a global movement, not just a community of companies in the United States. I don't think we had any idea how to make that happen. Like no idea. And largely it happened by others coming to us to say, I want to do this in my region. That happened where you guys are, with a leader who literally at a pub in Oxford said, I'm going to build the B Corp movement in Australia and New Zealand. So I think if that's true, then the only smart thing that we've done is just like allowing for that to happen. And people have built and it's been amazing. I mean, at this point, I think just about 30% maybe at this point of the B Corp community is in the US, give or take. And by the end of this year, it'll be 25%, and it'll continue to go down, not because it's not growing, but because the rest of the world is growing faster. And so that's been one great surprise for me. The second one has been on the policy front and sort of other forms of collective action. I'm not sure that we thought all that carefully from the beginning about the power of these companies deciding to act together. And so, there's legislation that's now been passed in first in 40 states in the US, but now in 10 other jurisdictions around the world to create a new corporate form. And that hasn't happened by us driving it from sitting here in Philadelphia and New York. It's happened because the B Corps have organized in their regions and started to recognize their power, the power of their influence, because you're all businesses and you employ people and you have an impact in your region. And so policymakers listen to you. And in that sense, you're very powerful marchers in a movement, advocates for change. And I don't think that I, at least, maybe Bart's smarter, maybe he thought of this, but I never sort of thought of the community in that way. And I think that that's some of the greatest power that the community has for the next 10 years is really about acting collectively.
I think the only thing, Joe, that we had a decent idea about was, we were far from the pioneers of the sustainability movement. We stand on the shoulders of dozens of other amazing leaders and thousands of companies that pre-existed Andrew, Bart, and Jay thinking anything about, sustainability. That gave us an opportunity, though, because when we arrived, we could survey where the world was at that juncture 15, 16 years ago. And one of the important decisions we made, and I think it was seeing where this might be headed, was that we really didn't think the next evolution of at the time it was called CSR, right? The corporate social responsibility movement, was about people buying a good product or supporting a good particular practice. We thought the evolution was about individuals supporting a good business. And so the idea of taking the idea of a certification up a level and making it about the whole company, rather than an organic apple or a fair trade cup of coffee or a green building that I work in, was based upon listening, over a period of, probably 24 months that led us to believe, yeah, this is where this is headed. And I think that that idea created a different relationship that we all have with certified B corporations that is quite different than the relationship you have with an organic apple or a cup of fair trade coffee. And so that, I think that's the only place that we could see something forward that made sense to us, then that was where the market was headed. But Andrew's right on all the rest of it. Again, coming back to the idea of a movement requires you let go, and therefore we have watched this blossom, owned by others now for well over a decade.
So should we take it from that then, that you've got nothing to do? How's it changed? How has it changed from the early days when you were founding this to now? Like, tell us about your day job and what the ordinary looks like for the both of you at this stage.
You want me to go first, Andrew, or you want to go?
Sure, I'm thinking. Go ahead.
So Joe, it's a good place to start to talk about how we divide our role, right? We are co-CEOs, and where I spend most of my time is on the creation, delivery, and verification of all of our standards. And so most of my time is focused on the business of the business and trying to make sure the clocks are running on time and we're building a system that is first and foremost, rigorous and credible, but that can scale. And so I spend most of my time trying to build the infrastructure globally with all of these great leaders across the globe to be able to manage what's been an incredible amount of growth for the movement over certainly the last 2 years have been insane. But it has been, we as a nonprofit, you can't raise, if we were a for-profit, Joe, we'd go raise $50 million of venture capital money and we'd invest it as growth capital and we'd all be off and running. As a nonprofit, you can't do that, right? And so you're always running to catch up. And so the vast majority of my time is spent on trying to determine the structures, the standards, the delivery vehicles, the governance, that will all build what eventually, not there yet, eventually will be a truly scalable, impactful movement. And so that's where I spend most of my time. On top of that, Andrew and I do both a fair amount of writing, speaking, presenting to try to let people know about what's happening in the movement. I spend a fair amount of time with actual key accounts, businesses that want to have a conversation about either a challenge or an opportunity. We spend a fair amount of time on partnerships, recognizing that if we're really going to build a movement, it has to be beyond B Lab. And so there's conversations with other standard setting organizations or distribution channels to try to make sure we spread all that out. And the way that it is different than when we started is at the beginning we did everything, right? There was 3 of us doing everything together all the time. And so it certainly has changed in that, but that's where I spend my time. Andrew should talk about how he really sees and oversees the other half of our business.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time on overall strategy, on relationships with lots of the influencers who we're trying to get to, whether that's through our narrative shift work or whether it's through our public policy work. And Bart referred to us being a nonprofit. Unfortunately, I spend a lot of my time trying to raise money, talking to foundations and wealthy individuals who want to support the B Corp movement philanthropically. That's still a pretty significant, this year, probably a little over 40% of our operating budget will come from philanthropy. And hopefully that'll shrink over time as the community continues to grow, but it will continue to be a significant lift to try to convince people to support the movement philanthropically, because we don't necessarily want it to be look too much like a business. We don't want it to just be a sustainable earned revenue stream. If it's sort of like meeting the market, then we're probably not doing our job as a mission-driven NGO to be out ahead of the market. And so that's got to continue to be funded by philanthropic support.
Joe, the last thing that I'd add that both of us spend a bunch of time on is governance. Like at the core of this work is a set of standards that have to be imbued with true integrity. And that means a network of governance that's really important, from our Standards Advisory Council and all of the regional Standards Advisory Councils to our global leadership team made up of all of our global partners all across the network, to the B Lab Global Board of Directors, that's an independent board. That governance is absolutely critical for our collective integrity. And so we both spend a fair amount of time on that as well.
Great. And what does the future hold for the both of you?
I mean, you know, when Eleanor starts this summer in this lead exec role, there'll be a period of transition. Obviously, like we want her to feel fully supported and up to speed, but we will both be out of the operations of B Lab very quickly, so that we're not in the way. The road is littered with founders who've like stuck around way too long or are still busy sort of like meddling in other people's business. And so, you know, we have to have a pretty intentional process of letting go from the operational stuff. And that said, we're staying inside the movement in order to be helpful. And so I think we'll do some amount of advising and some amount of being deployed, basically as Eleanor and the other executive directors around the world of the different B Lab partner organizations want us. And then finally, we'll still be involved, like Bart just talked about, governance. We have board roles. And so, you know, I think that'll be an important place for us to play a role in thinking about governance, like the next generation of governance of the movement, but really all of that time outside of the operations of the organization.
Great, thank you. And I've just seen the questions in the chat. Thank you, Kira, for pointing me there. So one of the questions from Michelle: why did you set up as a nonprofit and not a social enterprise?
That's a great question. You know, Bart started to address this a little while ago. I think we could have created a sustainable business model if we had wanted to. When we were starting, all three of us were coming from the private sector, and we didn't have we hadn't worked in this sector, and we thought it was really important to establish trust, to make sure that people knew like there wasn't something else in it for us. And I think that we thought we were clear it was always going to be, that was going to always be a suspicion at the beginning if we had set this up as a business. I think the second thing is that fundamentally, while we're building a movement, at the center of that movement is a set of standards for social and environmental impact. And if this was a business, I think we are all aware of ratings agencies and other kinds of like for-profit businesses that have this obligation to create trust, that have violated that over and over again in order to make money. And so I think we felt like it was really important, particularly for the standards, to establish this as a nonprofit that people would be able to truly rely on. I don't know if there's anything else, Bart, you want to add to that.
Nope. Those are the two principal reasons why we made that decision. It was a hard decision, you know, and coming back to trying to scale a movement without risk capital. You know, having had the good fortune, Joe, of having run both a for-profit and a nonprofit, I will tell you that not having access to risk capital is a real challenge for nonprofits. And we have felt that for every day of 16 years now.
Yeah, I hear you. So from Michelle, another Michelle, I think, another question. As a B consultant based in, forgive me if I say this incorrectly, Bundjalung country, which is Byron Bay, I'm curious and observing a lot. As I take companies and people through their B Corp journey, one of the things I feel is missing from the assessment or the journey is the connection to our Indigenous wisdom. I feel there is a lot that can be integrated. Now, I appreciate you may not necessarily be the best people to answer this question, but happy to hear your thoughts on it.
Only with due humility to say I completely agree. You know, that one of the things, the reason why the standards evolve is the recognition that we know we don't have it right. And so we're now on version 6 of the assessment. Version 7 is in process. And as I think probably many of you know, we're also talking about reevaluating our performance requirements to be a certified B Corporation, and that's happening simultaneously. And all of that begins with the knowledge, the certitude that what we have, I'm incredibly proud of, but it can absolutely be improved. And that is across many, many fronts, including learning more and incorporating also, frankly, how companies should interact with Indigenous populations. We had at our Global Network Assembly just 2 weeks ago, we brought in 2 folks to speak to us directly about the wisdom from Indigenous people. And it was breathtaking and humbling. And so I'm in full agreement and encourage you and anyone else to continue to give us good feedback on how to make the standards better. I couldn't agree more.
Thank you. I guess that leads sort of naturally into another question about, with the advent of the Black Lives Matter movement and sort of racial justice, changes, issues in the US specifically. What have you learned about how B Corps and the B Corp movement can participate in racial, positive changes to racial justice and equity?
So this has been a long journey for B Lab, and one that we shouldn't even begin to pretend that we are like ahead of the game on, because it's super complicated, and especially as an organization that was started by 3 white men, it's particularly complex. What I would say is that we've been on a long journey, and I think luckily for us, long before George Floyd, there have been a series of other things, like that happens to be the one that's sort of like blown up and brought to light and created a racial justice reckoning in the United States, and I think in some other places too. But there were a long series of similar kinds of acts of unjust racialized violence in the United States before George Floyd, and B Lab had started to tackle some of these things even too late, but at least a number of years ago. We started to build a team focused on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we started by, I think, with a recognition that long before you go and try to build your B Corp community differently, that we needed to focus on our own organization first and try to do some deep learning there. And so that's been a lengthy process. And often people talk about that just in terms of like building diversity on a team, but it's not just about diversity, it's about everything, about how all of our practices, how we go through a governance practice, or when we're hiring people, like what the process is in order to ensure that there's an equitable process, not just a good outcome. And so that's been a long journey for us internally. At the same time, each of the B Corp communities around the world has been going through, I think, a reckoning on this front, and the U.S. and B Lab U.S. and Canada in particular, because since George Floyd, has really made some strong commitments that are both about the practices of the existing B Corps to try to integrate better what we call JEDI practices into those companies, whether it's about hiring or governance or environmental justice issues. So it's about that on one hand, and on the other hand, it's about who's in the community in the first place and starting to try to create the kinds of programming and opportunities that make the B Corp community welcoming and valuable, so that businesses that are run by people of color actually want to be part of it and see a use in it, not just so that you can say that you have businesses that are led by people of color. So this has been like a long and I would say pretty challenging process, and it's pretty unfinished.
Yeah, complex, complicated. So another question here from Rosanna. B Corps are good at collaborating and working with each other, but any tips on how we can accelerate meaningful and productive connectivity with public policy and the work of not-for-profits?
I'm happy to start that one, Bart. Like, I'm closest to this in the US, although I see it happening. I see it happening in your part of the world. I see it happening in the UK. I see it happening in Europe on the public policy front, where the B Corp community is really like playing this powerful leadership role. I think our job is to give it the tools and to help do some of the organizing. So for example, in the US, there's a piece of legislation that will hopefully get introduced in the United States Senate in the next month or two, that focuses on some of these issues of shareholder primacy and stakeholder governance that the B Corp community really cares about. And in anticipation of that, we've been training B Corps to be ready once that happens to advocate for that public policy change. And I think that role that B Lab can play is in helping to organize that, but ultimately the power is not B Lab telling a policymaker what to do. It's the companies, and it's the companies acting collectively where all of that power is. So I think there's tremendous power in that. And we've seen it in other ways too. There are over 1,000 B Corps that have made a commitment to be net zero by 2030. And I think it's another example of like the community organizing. There are a lot of B Corps in Europe that have been, and particularly in the B Corp community in Poland, that have basically like dropped everything else that they were doing over the last month to organize themselves to make sandwiches and take them to the train stations in Poland to meet refugees and make sure that they're fed and help them find housing. There's a lot of power in a community of businesses being able to like bring their different skills and resources to the table, whether it's a situation like in Ukraine, or around climate or around racial justice.
Joe, the only thing I'd build on that for the person who asked the question, and it gets back to one of your earlier questions about what has surprised you. I have been consistently surprised by the ability of a small community of leaders to advance meaningful policy in places all over the globe. One of the things that I had dead wrong was that I thought we were going to have to build a community of tens of thousands of B corporations before we would be able to advocate for policy change. I didn't think we'd have the means, the collective voice. Dead wrong. You can make an enormous amount of progress with a relatively small community of leaders who are willing to come together with one voice around an issue. It's been proven over and over and over again in this community over 16 years, and it blows me away every time. The fact that we have meaningful legislation on the floor of Parliament in Britain about making all companies in the United Kingdom, the equivalent of benefit corporations, and it has real traction at this juncture of this movement, just floors me. It absolutely floors me. And it reinforces this idea that I think you all, by the way, huge congratulations. I think you all just passed 400 certified B corporations. And with 400 certified B corporations, you can make some friggin' noise. I kid you not. It's really quite powerful. And so I just want to make sure.
I think that's super. Sorry to interrupt, Bart. I was just going to add, like, a cool story about this to me is just the there are not even 5,000 certified B corporations. There are only, I think, about 30 or a little over 30 B Corps that are public companies, because we're like, and most of that's even happened in the last 18 months. So this is like a pretty rapid transition happening. And last fall, in December, the largest asset manager on the planet, BlackRock, which manages like $10 trillion of assets globally. I mean, they're massive, and they're the biggest mover of markets. Having like not paid that much attention to the B Corp movement for its first years, they made an announcement in the end of December that one of their top 5 priorities for the way they engage with companies was to support companies that want to become benefit corporations, that want to create stakeholder governance in their legal structures. That's happened because a few thousand companies on the planet have been making noise about doing business in a different way. It didn't take millions of people marching in the streets. It's taken a few thousand companies, most of them not that big, making a lot of noise about doing business in a different way to turn the largest investment manager on the planet in a totally different direction. And the job isn't done. I'm not naive that now that means that all of their money is being allocated to companies like B Corps. We have a long ways to go. But the fact that they drove that shift, like, it's hard sometimes to keep track of when you're sort of in the business of systems change, of whether you're actually doing anything to change the system, because it's such a long game. But something like that's happened with only the power and advocacy of a small number of companies, I think says a lot about how powerful this community really is. And that to me is really exciting.
Great. I think we're getting close to time. So I guess I've just got one final question for you both. All businesses around the world are being called on at the moment to make ethical decisions, values-based decisions that would not have been incumbent on them in the past. So B Corp or not, right? The game is changing. And I guess it might just be helpful to hear any advice you have for business leaders in leaning into those places of discomfort, or where they're not necessarily so confident in their leadership, and being able to lead with values, lead with ethics, the way that you two have both been able to steer this movement. No advice.
Yeah, it's a tough last question.
Well, okay, I'll make it easy for you. Any final comments or things that you'd like to impart to the business leaders?
The one thing I would say about that is, like, I'm not sure there's a choice. Like, if we want to sort of go home at the end of the day and like face our children who face a pretty uncertain future, uncertain about democratic systems of government, uncertain about climate, uncertain about racial or like indigenous equity and justice issues. I don't know how anybody doesn't make that choice. And I think the power of the B Corp movement is really the power of having like a community of people to make that choice with you. Because I do think that, like, we all know leadership can be really lonely. And I think the beautiful thing about this movement is it's like a whole movement of leaders acting together. And that's a lot less lonely and makes it a lot easier to make some of those like tough decisions, but ones that we have to make if we want to realize the kind of society that we all want to live in.
And Joe, the only thing I'd add to that is I about 10 years ago, I was watching one of the magnificent leaders in this community, a gentleman named Gonzalo Munoz, who is one of the founders of System of A, give a talk. And if you ever have a chance to see Gonzalo give a talk, sign up. He's unbelievable. And most of it's completely off the cuff. And he said, how I ended up in values-driven business was early on in my career, somebody said to me, it's not personal, it's just business. And it was the most offensive thing that anybody ever said to me. What do you mean? It's not personal, it's just business. How can you divorce your values, your ethics, like who you are, from what you do? And the people who have inspired me most over 16 years are those folks who have figured out how to live a values-aligned life, where those values run through everything they do, how they show up every day in every community is values consistent. And so that's what I'll leave for our leaders here, is be authentic and live a values-aligned life. The rest will figure itself out. And thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll hand back to Andrew, but thank you both so much for your time and your candor.
Joe, you're
Thanks
good at
great
this.
questions, Joe.
Yeah, nicely done.
I like to keep them a little bit tricky.
I'm just simply going to say a thank you as well. Joe's joined us today from Auckland, Bart from Philadelphia, and Andrew from New York. We really appreciate your time, your energy, and your leadership, all three of you. You're all doing incredible things, and we're all the better for having had this chance to hear from you. So to everybody else, have a great day. Enjoy what's left of B Corp month, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Have a good
everybody.
day. Bye.